am beginning the recording. This talk is being recorded, and I'm about to drop the accessibility copy into the chat. I just want to make sure that I've got the right URL for that. Shouldn't have to. So if anyone needs an accessibility copy, there is a link to a PDF of the talk and that tiny URL in the chat. Right. Just some very quick, very light housekeeping. Can I please ask everyone to mute themselves and turn off your videos during Rebecca's talk? That will keep any random changes of focus from Rebecca while she's speaking, and just keep the video quality as high as possible. The chat will remain open during the talk, so if you want to rate, clap your hands or shoot off fireworks or otherwise celebrate the brilliance of the unfolding talk, you are encouraged to do so. Also to write down your questions as they occur to you. I will go through the chat noting questions and then call on people to ask their questions to Rebecca after she's done speaking. We should have the same amount of time for questions that we have for the talk, so plenty of time to expand on Rebecca's ideas and to explore further. Are there any questions about the procedure before I turn things over to the main actors? Great. In that case, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Professor Maruka, who will introduce our speaker tonight. Lisa Maruka is Professor of English at Wayne State University and the author of the work of print, authorship in the English text trade, 1660 to 1760. And
what the hell?
Over to you.
Elaine, you froze for a minute, but I assume you passed it to me. All right. Thank you to the Open Digital Seminar organizers, past and present, for starting and continuing this program, allowing us to share our work and to be edified by our colleagues. This, I just want to personally say, this has been a really bright spot during the pandemic for me and many others, and one that I hope continues long after the coronavirus is a bad memory, which it cannot happen soon enough. Today, I'm pleased to be introducing Rebecca Shapiro, my friend and an associate professor at City University of New York's College of Technology. I met Rebecca just a few years ago when I signed up to do a time slot at the mentoring program she organized called The Doctor is In. If you're not familiar with this, it's a fantastic event that's been offered at the American Society for 18th Century Studies for several years. Rebecca organized faculty with a variety of expertise to sit at a table for a certain time and be there for people who either signed up or dropped in with mentoring questions. These could be about anything from grant writing to teaching to work-life balance to how to write a book proposal and many other things, I'm sure. The program has been so successful that in 2020, ODSECS honored Rebecca with their Graduate Mentoring Award, the first time it was given to someone who does not have a graduate program at their university. So congratulations again, Rebecca. However, Rebecca is not just a good human. She is also a scholar with a longtime interest in 18th century studies and especially linguistics. It is hard to be an interdisciplinarian, but she makes it look easy. Her book, Fixing Babel, an historical anthology of applied English lexicography, collects prefaces from early English dictionaries from the 17th and 18th centuries. It has been called an invaluable collection, beautifully edited with instructive commentary. She is also published in the areas of pedagogy, both past and present, 18th century fiction, and she has a forthcoming book on lexicography and law. She has been an associate editor on the Digital Humanities Project Lexicon of Early Modern English, an officer for the Dictionary Society of North America, and on the executive board of the Invisible Disability Project, among many other services that she contributes to. I would also like to say that she knows how to make the best of a bad situation, as a project we will hear about today was conceived when she was under lockdown. And by lockdown, I mean like not leaving her apartment locked down in the Barbados in the spring of 2020. I know we are excited to hear about her work. So without further ado, I will pass the mic. Thank you, Dr. Shapiro.
Thank you so much. So yeah, what Lisa is talking about is absolutely true. I was supposed to be in Barbados for a sabbatical sabbatical work. I was supposed to be teaching a class. I was supposed to be doing research, and then COVID. And when people talk about lockdown, I have begun to laugh bitterly, oh, paradise. No, paradise was my kitchen. Because we were all under a 24-hour curfew that was but I did get access to the roof, so that was good. I had a whole other room. I was able to save this project because a friend of mine brought me here, and he and I had been talking about what to do last time. And so we decided, Jason Siegel, who's at the University of the West Indies, and I, well, let me just start. I found this topic when my 2020 sabbatical project had to be abandoned while I was teaching in Barbados and the country went on 24-hour curfew during COVID. So not just lockdown, but curfew. A colleague, Jason Siegel, suggested I write about how the term Little England, mostly known as the nickname of Barbados, has evolved to apply to different places, eventually focusing on what made the term for Barbados so long-lasting. The term has shifted and reflects the colonization and decolonization process of much of the English Empire and has been used in various ways for various causes, often simultaneously, which has made it really difficult to trace. It's moved from a region in Wales where English people settled, to regions where the English set up outposts, to be used by enslavers and planters to claim connection to the mother country, and a way to connect white and Black Barbadian elites, and finally, most recently, to a derisive term used by Barbadians that mocks those sentimental for a colonial past. Because of its key place in imperial history, it's Barbados that I want to spend most of the time on, showing how the senses of the term symbolic and real have coalesced. So, let's see here. Okay. If most of us hear the term Little England lately, we probably think of Brexit's ferocious struggles between parties and organizations devoted to either stay in the EU or be part of a larger international unit, or leave and retain the special Englishness that had been diluted by contact. Some of the nationalistic rhetoric of the Leave group reflects an us versus them mentality that privileges an idea of an England that periodically contracts to save its essential nature, but which may ultimately be its undoing, or at least we'll see about Scotland. No matter how the Leavers are portrayed in more liberal press, their concerns are couched in populist and often very poignant terms of how the people need a voice in their governance, and we want our country back. The reasons for this are myriad, but there's a fair amount of anxiety and fear that their English self-regard is not actually self-warranted. Okay. So this slide shows the tension between those who differ on what the borders of England actually contains, or who and what actually belongs within it, and are permitted to call themselves English. The struggle has existed for centuries. Part of the ongoing issue is that the idea of England and Englishness migrated throughout the empire's various peoples and nations sought to either connect with perceived Englishness or separate from it. Thus, what links the iterations of the term, or the red thread that kind of knits the senses together etymologically, is an England of the mind, a conceptual collection of signifieds that make up the sign of England as an original and pure small island and its constituent parts, and the little Englands strive to belong, fending off advances. The surge in usage during certain periods reflects anxieties at home and abroad about what exactly is England and how its status is affected by domestic and foreign events. So fleshing out this idea owes a great deal, by the way, to Benedict Anderson's theory of what makes a people or a nation and how they imagine themselves. And you can't see all of these spikes, and Ngram viewer doesn't go prior to 1800, but the 1800, the first red circle is around emancipation, and or at least the colonization, and then the Gladstone and emancipation and anti-slavery movement. And then 1900, I haven't quite figured out what causes that massive spike, but I'm imagining that it has something to do with, again, contracting of the empire as well as getting ready for World War I. The 1950s is most likely in and around Windrush. And then the 2000s, and then the last red circle is Brexit. So this, so anyway, I kind of like this, and I like to be able to see how terms change over time and how their usage changes. Okay. So Lynn Murphy, who's a linguist, and her specialty is the difference between British English or English and American English. And I've had a long-standing discussion as to whether or not these are homonyms or just different senses of the same term. And this slide is from the Dictionary of Confusable Terms, and it indicates that Little England is actually two terms and are homonyms. What binds the two is a sense from which the others actually derive, a small place that cleaves to its so-called English values and origins. And it's common practice, of course, for people who are lexicographers and also just people who want to know, to consult the dictionary. And, you know, Jack Lynch's, you could look it up, and so I did. I turned to the Oxford English Dictionary to provide a summarized idea of the term and its senses. And the very first sense is a name given to a place considered to resemble or epitomize England on a small scale, a colony or microcosm of England, a foreign place full of English people. Holinshed's Chronicles explains that Little England or Low England is about 8 miles in length and 4 in breadth, very well replenished with towns. It's referring to Wales. Other examples do not refer to a place as much as they refer to an idea, that there's a qualitative English identity to be transported elsewhere that retains a separateness wherever it is. So you see this difference between place that is distinct for being English and a place that takes on an English identity. So the Dictionary of Confusable Terms implies that Little England requires more than one entry, or should have one, but because they're not correlative, but I'm really convinced that they are in fact etymologically related. The oldest Little England is in Pembrokeshire, Wales, and its full name is Little England Beyond Wales. It had for centuries been Anglophone and maintained an English identity even after the devolution and the introduction of Welsh into schools, with the population, interestingly, even carrying genetic markers. Scholars generally accept that the region became anglicized as a result of colonization after the Norman period, coupled with a later influx of Flemish people. It's remained Anglophone long after the population intermarried and became more assimilated. The area is demarcated by the Landsker Line, which you can see more closely in the red on the right, rather than little images on the left. But it's an Anglo-Saxon name for a series of castles and fortifications built to protect the English and Flemish from the Welsh. The Landsker Line also demarcates an isogloss between the two languages, as well as cultural differences between the South and the West. The idea that there's been a continuous element of Englishness over the centuries has been questioned, though, and lately the possibility that there might be a linguistic or an invisible linguistic division between the two areas is still a source of contention. And the references to Little England beyond Wales start in the 1500s. Let's see. Okay. In addition to Little England beyond Wales, there are colonized places that are also given the appellation, typically because the geography is reminiscent of England, or there came to be a decent or significant concentration of Anglophones or civil servants. They imported food, dress, culture, laws, and more. They also brought with them the concept of a smaller version of England within another region, and this concept helped fuel the imperial imagination that England was justified in extending to other regions such as Virginia, India, Sri Lanka, and Singapore. And apparently there's actually 2 Little Englands in India. This one on the far left is for somewhere in Virginia. Okay. Whereas other colonies had smaller areas within the name Little England, signifying this connection with Englishness, Barbados is the only place to which the label applies to it entirely. During its early colonial history, Barbados was a critical point on the transatlantic slave trade and the triangle trade. Such importance meant that by the 17th century, it was where English slave traders landed with kidnapped and enslaved human beings who were forced to labor, produce rum, brandy, golden syrup, sugar, and other things that were sent to England and other colonies. One of the most important scholars of Barbados history, Sir Hilary Beckles, writes, by the 1650s, England was grandly celebrating Barbados as its premier global investment. The island had provided impetus for the breakthrough into profitable colonialism the nation had long desired but found irritatingly elusive. Henceforth, the national discourse on trade and economic growth, wealth creation and mercantilism, sovereignty and security and ethnic identity were tightly tied to the colony's performance as a Black slave society. England's entrepreneurship forged and refashioned the world economic order. Investors and imperial administrators seized the moment and abandoned traditional labor values and relations. The sugar plantations, stocked with thousands of easily replaceable enslaved Africans, spun super profits. The entire island was quickly stripped of an internal frontier and transformed into endless fields of sugar plantations. Record levels of white-owned wealth and Black deaths defined the slave plantations as a best practice in the new business culture. Barbados represented for the English a symbol of a global enrichment. Investors representing the English royal family and its ruling elites, including the military and clergy, rushed to the island to secure their share of the wealth. And indeed, I recently saw a sign in Barbados that prevented vending because the property belonged to the crown. And this property, of course, was empty. So this is Barbados denuded. And it would not ever have looked like this prior to the English landing. Okay. As a result of their important place in the 17th and 18th century British economy, those who settled Barbados created a narrative that the Caribbean island was actually a part of England rather than a satellite region within another. Barbados was deemed distinct in that while geographically far, the earliest planters and enslavers specifically positioned themselves as socially and politically equivalent near to what they called Mother England, thus attempting a genealogical connection. The desire for connection, though, is one-sided. Quote, the West Indian settlers conceived of themselves as the Atlantic settlers most deeply connected to Mother England. Yet they proved to be a striking there proved to be a striking disconnection between how the planters viewed themselves and how they were viewed or perceived themselves as being viewed by the people at home whose opinion and high regard they valued most. This disconnection proved particularly problematic as the West Indian colonists struggled to find their place in the Atlantic Empire, unable to find the acceptance they craved in Britain, uncertain about their relationship with the American mainland colonies, and reluctant to embrace a distinct sense of English or island identity. Despite attempts at convincing outsiders and visitors from England that Barbados was indeed a miniaturized England, those attempts were rebuffed. Moreover, the more West Indians failed to convince British observers of their genteel civility, the more desperately they clung to an idealized sense of Britishness to which they were ultimately unable to conform. So while they initially echoed the political fractiousness of their mainland neighbors during the upheaval of the Glorious Revolution, the Caribbean colonists of the 18th century and after increasingly worked to emphasize their close connection to and dependence upon Britain. For those from the West Indies, home signified England, and yet the connection was attenuated. Hence the term Little England was then a forlorn designation when qualified at every turn by the English themselves. By the 19th century, though, as the British Empire began to contract itself, Little England and Barbados came to signify an English colonial exceptionalism that formed a strong foundation with the larger Caribbean settler region and presided over the other colonies. We can see this in a New Year's poem, and there's so many examples of 18th and 19th century newspapers, but this is one of them that is not sort of a passing reference or some sort of boring, mention. It's a New Year's poem in the Bridgetown Mercury Gazette from 1814. And by the way, so many of the early newspapers are in a state of really tragic disrepair because of the poor conditions that they're being held under. They're not in prison, but they've just been uploaded, by the way, by the British Museum. Anyway, the author writes, "Welcome the babe old time hath made us, be thou propitious to Barbados. Lo, the prophetic urchin smiles on Little England, queen of isles." So this primacy occurred because the white planters and enslavers, who were largely English, created a caste system that put them at the top of the social and economic structure. Whereas the Irish, who had been largely indentured servants before the advent of the African slave trade, became separate from and far beneath them. It also contributed to the liminal status of the Irish as being not fully English and not fully Barbadian in the development of the English or Little English identity. And so part of that was who gets to call themselves English, who gets to call themselves Little English. That the elite class in Barbados had created a structure of white and wealthy Englishmen who presided over poor whites, who were primarily Irish, and enslaved Africans, meant that this class-based and racial hierarchy in turn allowed Barbados to affirm an identity as a smaller plot of English soil that happened to be separated by an ocean. The power dynamic is deeply embedded by the 18th century and has held firm throughout the 20th. During the 19th century, as a result of policies that Gladstone and his allies implemented, the empire began to pay more attention to issues at home, particularly in response to powerful opposition to the transatlantic slave trade, reviving the sense of a Little England that referred to a protectionism of the English island. By the way, this protectionist sense, which I don't discuss here, was prevalent in the 17th and 18th centuries during fervid struggles between Catholics and Protestants. Deprived even more of its wobbly connection to England, Barbados attempted to wield more power in the Caribbean. So while proud that the colony had never been settled or conquered by another European power, Barbados's ascendancy began to shift. At times, it was seen as either the arbiter of the colonial project, and at others, it was seen as taking on more authority than it deserved. While Barbados had once been the seat of English power in the Atlantic colonies, it was also contracting. Other islands, for example, notably British Guyana and Trinidad, appealed to be considered separate from Barbadian oversight. While acknowledging that Barbados was indeed Little England, these colonies felt that their laws and culture were far too different to be subordinate. most especially with respect to employment and slavery laws. They considered that the Barbadian employment and slavery laws to be so much more vicious than their own. On the other hand, when it came to technological progress, Barbados positioned itself as being in the forefront. So when the local government proposed a rail system, Barbados characterized itself as standing out from the others by virtue of its supposed proximity to the mother country. The author of a newspaper article reminded readers, if I may be permitted to compare small things with great, this view is sufficient to open the eyes not only of Barbadians, but of every fellow colonist. And shall Little England be considered backward in the race of improvements? The response by many of them was to create and imagine an idealized version of England outside of its boundaries and focus on Barbados as an almost paradisical place with lush greenery, architecture, and place names reminiscent of the old country, social norms that provided an illusion that England and the English were still on top. Parishes still retain English names. Neighborhoods still are called Strathclyde, Brighton, Deacon's Farm, Edgehill, and Kensington, among others. Thus, we see a nostalgic representation of England in Barbados, and it makes sense that people would capitalize literally on the connection between the colony that was compared most favorably to England as being most like England. The envisioning of Barbados as a little England took on positive associations and enabled an English exceptionalism far from the mother country and in spite of any negative consequences that those from Barbados would actually experience if they returned to England. The exceptionalism was localized so that visitors to the Caribbean and those living there posited that Barbados evoked the topography, social structure, breeding, and the buildings in England. In the St. Christopher Gazette from the early 19th century, the author of an article expounds on how the area resembles Scotland. Closes with, the characteristic beauty of Barbados is its finished cultivation and its air of life and domestic comfort, which the face of the entire country presents. And the author writes of how he had traveled to nearby islands, but there was no one on board who did not express a secret satisfaction at getting back once more to the palms and the white houses of the ancient colony of Little England. Positioning Barbados within the Caribbean as just like England but smaller, or like I have up here, just like England but really hot, meant that it could also foster a sense of nostalgia and similacity. So an imagined idea of Barbados that really never existed. Thus, Little England was depicted as more than a satellite used by both whites throughout the empire and later Commonwealth, as well as post-colonial Barbadians, to suggest that Barbados was a familiar and comforting place that was like England, but in some ways better than England. This move created an escapism from current realities and enabled Barbados and England to pivot to leisure and travel. Tourist literature by non-Barbadians and Barbadians alike was uncritically positive and uncritically attempted to create an ideal location free of associations of enslavement or catastrophe that had been effected by England, the English, and its proxy populations such as the Irish, Scots, and colonial Americans. Not only did England and Barbados connect the two places for tourism and visiting, but Barbados specifically claimed special status in times of need or upheaval. MPA Burroughs writes that Barbados proffered assistance to England, and especially in this famous phrase, "Carry on, England, little England is behind you." But what makes this assertion most interesting is that for every major conflict from the 19th and 20th centuries in which Britain was involved, this message was sent. And I found references to the claim that a message bearing these sentiments was sent on 4 separate occasions: the Napoleonic War, the Boer War, and both World War I and World War II. So writers such as the late Kamau Brathwaite and Austin Clarke have noted that the claims for the world wars, with Clarke squarely laying the accusation on Grantley Adams, the elite Black lawyer and politician. This is significant because, as Burroughs explains, Earlier message would have been sent by elite whites, whereas the one allegedly sent by Adams would have been sent by an elite Black politician representing a nation of people who would likely not have sought such a connection. That this phrase punctuates different turbulent times contributes to the imaginary nature, not just of the phrase, but of the nation itself as being necessary for England and elites in Barbados, both white and Black. The exceptionalism that Barbados has demonstrated, first by white planters and enslavers, and then by Black elites, has affected its relationship with other Caribbean nations. As with the example above of how other islands wanted independence from a Barbadian oversight, others have felt diminished and objectified by Barbados. And because of, or in spite of, the special relationship between England and Barbados, they still mock Barbados for its apparent obedience to authority and its false sense of superiority. A disturbing 18th century example from Antigua is of how a minister sneered at efforts to provide immigrants from other islands medical care, suggesting that Barbadians were hardier and in better health than others, and to leave their blissful island for another would be foolish. A newspaper article reports that we find that owing to some rapid and unaccountable deterioration of the salubrity of Little England, or some hallucination then or now, and it seems that the healthy quality of Barbados air has taken its departure with the plentiful supply of wholesome water when poor deluded laborers were wickedly beguiled by false promises to leave that land of flowing milk and honey. We see that the Barbadians perceive themselves to be better than those of the other islands, though it must be pointed out that the peasants referred to in the newspaper article were poor whites and former slaves. The comparisons go on, though, and to some degree they are very humorous. 2019, there was a very vicious and active fight over Rihanna's citizenship that was claimed both by Barbados and Jamaica. I want to point out that I've seen her childhood home on a street renamed Rihanna Way. So there's that. Still rages on. Let me go back. The vexed relationship with other regional nations has continued, particularly with Trinidad and Jamaica, both of which have histories of vigorously resisting enslavement. David Lowenthal writes that the rivalry between Trinidad and Barbados is as bitter as their scenery is contrasting. He later discusses how others in the Caribbean excoriated Barbados for being Little England, that is a tropical isle of white, and that Barbados became unacceptable for reasons that had never been thought of before, including the fact that it was, quote, guilty of the crime of crimes to have been English since 1625. In the 19th century, the Jamaican press printed a pejorative comment by an English traveler that Barbados reflects most faithfully the social and intellectual values and prejudices of a golf club in outer London. Such criticisms echo earlier ones that show the desire of white planters and enslavers to be like the English, and indeed Barbadians have been said to be more English than the English. Yet they found themselves as Little Englanders to be neither here nor there. Similarly, the issues presented as a result of the sense of Little England perpetuates to this day, hence the slide. It's been difficult for Barbadians to feel independent from English values and attitudes, and when Black Barbadians have been confronted with racism or objectification, they are left with confusion and anger. The historical identification with and exceptionalism about a connection to England, even though they were former enslavers and oppressors, has meant that some Black Barbadians experienced cognitive dissonance when they realized that the English did not accept them. So for example, universities students from Barbados in the 1950s discussed the English palpable racism and ignorance. You want to do the right thing, and if you have any pride at all, you get hurt. Because in Barbados, you've been brought up to think of yourself as coming from Little England, and you suddenly discovered that you aren't English at all, and that all the English consider you an outsider and uncivilized. and you were so proud of belonging to Little England at home, and English history was your history and you were a part of it, you thought. When they realized that they were not English at all, the result revealed a deep cultural wound that has yet to heal. Some Barbadians were critical of their nation being little, desiring a self-sustaining identity more Caribbean in focus. This especially occurred in the 1960s and 70s when the English colonies fought for more independence, as England itself was convulsing with riots, economic woes, and also xenophobia. Instead of maintaining ties with the former colonizer, many politicized Barbadians sought to become self-reliant and built relations with other nations in the Caribbean as well as in Africa. Among those who became disillusioned with or resentful toward the connection between Mother England and Little England used the term derisively for those who believed in reciprocity and equivalency. George Lamming has famously written how education was of English subjects and English language, which was utterly divorced from lived experience, but reinforces the mother country and Little England dichotomy. Another critic writes that Lamming's education reproduces the notion of Barbados as Little England, a replica of Big England. This is more real, for it is played out over and over again in the colonial narrative in books and on the blackboard. Indeed, the fictional character in Lamming's novel, the teacher informs him startlingly that slavery would never happen in Barbados, not in Little England. So we see internalized English and then Barbadian exceptionalized reinforced, as Lamming writes in The Country of My Skin, that generations had lived and died in this remote corner of a small British colony, the oldest and least adulterated of British colonies, Barbados, or Little England as it was called in the local school texts. Likewise, in Pleasures of Exiles, Lamming writes cuttingly of how his community was not nearly as interested in knowing the people's history of Barbados, but would think, good old England and old Little England. They had never parted company since they met way back in the reign of Charles, or was it James? They weren't sure, but it was a Charles or James, God bless his name. Austin Clarke, in this title is one of my favorite ever. Growing up stupid under the Union Jack is slashing his criticism of his education. He is mystified by a Wordsworth poem that mentions daffodils, which are foreign to his country, as well as having to write a history exam on Mother England, of which he knows nothing. Clarke mockingly repeats the story of the Grantley Adams telegram to England, this time allegedly centering World War II, that Barbados would support and save its colonizer and former enslaver. These examples show a growing realization of how irrelevant England was becoming to Black Barbadians and a sort of source of righteous anger. Even while the term and concept of Barbados as a smaller version of England was challenged by these and other authors, the term has remained, though, in a kind of limbo, sometimes used in positive or neutral ways, and sometimes in dismissive and contemptuous ways. So archives of the Barbadian newspaper, The Nation, reveals both senses being used concurrently. It shows that there's not yet a public decision about which one of those two is primary. If one were to order them lexicographically, the decision could be difficult, as the term's positive connotations has a much longer history among whites, but the term's negative connotation reflects the growing distaste by the Black majority and recent scholarship. Things are changing. I began this paper almost a year ago during their first COVID lockdown in May 2020, and that summer as demonstrations in support of Black Lives Matter spread across the world, there were attempts at some in Barbados. It wasn't easy because of extreme restrictions against movement and gathering, but people tried. The first demonstration held in front of the US Embassy in Bridgetown was short and, to say the least, tepid. The organization group had gotten official permission and a permit, but then the police revoked the permit, threatening arrest if we didn't disperse. And my being a foreign national meant that I did not want very much to be arrested. I overheard a woman as we were leaving and as she left saying, "Typical behavior of fucking Little England," disparaging the police for representing the authorities and not supporting Black Lives Mattering either in the US or in Barbados. The women's derogatory usage of Little England was timely. Shortly after that event and two other peaceful demonstrations at Heroes Park, formerly Trafalgar Square, commemorating Lord Nelson's victory over the French in the Napoleonic Wars, the Barbadian organizers focused on removing the statue of Nelson. One of my friends decided that he would volunteer to send it on a ship and throw it overboard. So the statue of Nelson, who is so famous for his ardent defense and promotion of the slave trade. I left Barbados shortly before the statue was removed, but I was able to take this photo written in Bajan dialect, not too hard to figure out, "Take me down," which is a fitting ventriloquizing for Nelson, who deprived those who had been enslaved the right to speak and name their own country. It seems now that Little England is beyond England, and it's going the way of the English Empire, and not a moment too soon. Thank you.
Sorry, having some technical challenges.
I think you're muted.
There
you are.
I've lost all the icons. I've lost everything. The screen's just gone white. So bear with me for a moment, please. Can everyone just give a round of applause to Rebecca, and I'll try to make this better. Oops. Contemplative pause as we attempt to rejoin. Excellent. Right, Lisa, I've made you co-host. I'm gonna have to disappear and come back.
All right, do you want me to, I can ask?
Yeah, if you can take over questions briefly, I will.
Yeah, no problem. No problem. All right, who has questions after the paper? Either one. Go ahead, Noel.
All right. That's the fascinating talk, Rebecca, and lots to think about. But the question that kept coming up while you were talking was, for me anyway, was if you're talking about Little England, whose England are we talking about? Because England itself is so regional. So, I mean, are we talking about a South England, a Yorkshire England, a Lancashire England, or is it a kind of fantasy creation that chooses bits and pieces of all of these, including Scotland and Wales, and that sort of creates this fictional space that we think of as England, that, you know, that even within England is not necessarily universal or recognizable?
So I have, I guess, two answers, one kind of short, one kind of long. It's about as objective as America, you know, or the US, right? I mean, don't forget, like, you know, Canada is part of America, yeah. But it's that ridiculous to imagine that there could be such an England. But from a lexicographical perspective, I mean, that's what sort of my my background and knowledge of England and English comes from. It would be primarily either London, England, where the seat of government is, or perhaps urban England. You know, for example, like in Edinburgh, England. But I would say that the Irish England or the Wales England, or to some extent this Scottish England, would be subordinated to the London England. And much like with respect to lexicography, almost all of the books and texts and dialect that were written about were, of course, you know, urban English, London elites.
King's English. Yeah, I was also thinking, I'm just going to say one more thing, short comment, that I saw a friend's post on Facebook a little while ago where she was doing some genealogy studies, and she said it was interesting to her to find that she was looking at ancestors who came from places like Scarborough and Whitby and Pickering, and settling in places called Scarborough, Pickering, and Whitby. So nothing changes, right?
No,
okay, thank you.
I mean, they tried very hard to, you know, duplicate these places and these place names. I currently, you know, I've been staying in the parish of St. Michael. And there's an incredibly violent area that I mentioned called Deacon's Farm. And yeah, I mean, and then there's this bizarre mall that's called Kensington Mall, and it looks nothing like you would expect. But there is a cheapside market, and it's exactly what you would want. Yeah, I think, I mean, I live in New York and New Jersey, and I live in the former town of Bergen. So it's, yeah, which is now Jersey City. So, you know, it's that kind of like trying to superimpose things that have never existed and won't.
Thank you so much. Apologies. My computer was so excited by Rebecca's talk that it just went, it whited it out and everything disappeared as a kind of mic drop moment. So apologies for that. It does not appear to have affected the recording, so it will all be smooth sailing on YouTube. I've got a question in the chat from Declan, and then Kevin, you've got your hand up. But Declan, can I invite you to ask Rebecca your question?
We might all be having these difficulties.
Hi, Rebecca. I don't know if you can hear me. My Wi-Fi is bad, but anyway. So it's just thanks for a really great talk. I just wanted to know a little bit about Britishness, and particularly after 1707, thinking about that evolution of Britishness and how that might fit into this view, this kind of decentered view, which is really interesting, of Little England in Barbados. So how does this map onto that evolution of Englishness in the period, and thinking particularly about reactionary Englishness in the period? So, you know, Wilkes and the Wilkesite movement, and it's very firmly a kind of England that, picking up on Noel's comment, I suppose, just a minute ago, it's kind of very rooted. And just thinking about how at odds that is really with Scottishness, Welshness and Irishness, and the Celtic fringes, as it were. So just wondering for your thoughts on that. But great paper, thank you very much.
Thanks so much. You know, I don't know how much I could speak with authority on the idea of Britishness, but I do know the place of the Irish within Barbados has been tragic and desolate and just utter desperation. Some of it their own making, but largely the making of the English. And because of how some of the Irish arrived in Barbados, they, and having been some of the first indentured servants, but yet white, there was sort of an imposition, from what I've been able to understand, of the stratification that had existed in Britain, between, the English imposing their values and, violently oppressing other people. So they continued to do that to the Irish to a greater extent, but to a lesser extent onto the Scots. And after indenturement ended and Barbados switched to enslavement, as Hilary Beckles writes, the Irish found themselves completely cut out of Barbadian sort of social structures and sort of the caste system. There was like this sort of side ethnicity, and there's this really fascinating. There's a lot of information about the white Barbadians, and particularly the Irish and the Irish in Barbados. And by the way, I want to point out that the Irish were never enslaved, but they were treated terribly. And the terrible treatment and abuse was legalized. So for example, it became illegal to harbor an Irish person who had left indenturement as harshly as it was to harbor a runaway enslaved person. There remains an area in one of the parishes, St. John, a very small and increasingly small group of people who are white Bajans, and they have a long-standing connection to Ireland, and they don't consider themselves Bajan in that sense, or Barbadian in the sense. They consider themselves Irish, and because they have not wanted to avail themselves of the majority, the opportunities that the majority Black community has tried to offer them, many of them are impoverished and still kind of set off from society. What's interesting though is that, going back to Rihanna, her last name, Fenty, is a famous, oh, by the way, I took out an entire paragraph on the etymology of the term for the Irish in Barbados, which is called redlegs. And somebody, I read this really interesting article that traces the etymology of redlegs and red shanks to England, to Ireland and Scotland. But the red leg community in Barbados is very tightly knit and very exclusive in sort of a negative way. So, but Rihanna's grandmother is one of those Irish redlegs. So it's kind of an interesting thing that people in Ireland are willing to, have Rihanna as one of their own, but I don't think it's really reciprocated. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that what the English did with the Irish in Barbados was just egregious, and it's trying to duplicate what had happened for hundreds of years.
Thanks, Rebecca. I want to make sure we have time for Kevin's question.
Yes, just briefly. Have you encountered any analysis of the Englishness in Little English that is political, in the sense of the Magna Carta legacy of citizenship and of the freeborn Englishman kind of thing? This is connected probably to the economics of being planters, but I'm interested in the idea of of the kind of colonial mentality in Barbados that was similar to the American colonies, where the elite insisted that they had the same rights as other Englishmen. So I was wondering if you've encountered any of that kind of discussion. Thank you.
You're my husband. Why are you asking a question like that?
Because, well, I know I'm your husband and I'm very grateful for this, but it occurs to me.
So I don't know. I do know that the Barbadians did not have the same rights in England as they did in Barbados. I don't know about the legal situation. I do know that the Home Office controlled and in some ways still controls some aspects of Barbadian government and society. But I really don't know about the rights and abilities of the Barbadian whites and the English whites.
Are there any other questions? I'm not seeing any in the chat, but I've lost part of the chat, I'm afraid. Now, we are out of time, technically. Can I just ask everyone to give a final huge round of applause to Rebecca for her really incredible, however you want, with real clapping or hands or in the chat. It was a fantastic paper. The phrase Little England has become so resonant in the last 4 years. And that was really, really helpful, tracking it through the colony to the would-be colonizers of Farage et al. I thank you. And I just want to put a last plug for next month's seminar, which is going to be a slightly different structure, very much in the tradition that Rebecca began with The Doctor Is In, where we're holding a space to talk about how to sustain both the study of 18th century studies and the studiers, the scholars and the scholarship, with a range of topics that will be hosted by members of the ODSECS community. So please do get your ticket and come and vent, ask questions, brainstorm solutions, and help hold each other up and sustain each other through these continually dark times. So thank you for your continued engagement with ODSECS, and thank you to Rebecca and Lisa for coming tonight.
Yes,
Thank you.
Thank you, Aline. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend.
I'd say happy Thanksgiving, but that's only here, so.
It's good.
Yeah.
Raise a glass.
That's right.
I've been given my Friday night. It's officially Friday night now.
That's right.
Rebecca, that was so fantastic. I did have a sneak peek because you sent me a paper earlier. So I've been thinking about how it became such a derisive term, and it's become a way of defining a particular nostalgia for a brutal kind of colonization, and yet also being embraced by the people that it's applied to. Nigel Farage is happy to be identified as a Little Englander, and he also sees it as a nostalgia for a particularly brutal form of colonialism.
Yeah.
And your paper just made that so clear, and why that might be. So thank you.
I was very happy to get those two images of him and Johnson. But yeah, it was